Well, hello, everyone. Oh my goodness, do we have an episode for you today? Welcome to the Empathy Power Up. My name is Kevin Shaw, and I've got Amy J. Wilson. Hey, Amy.
Yay! Hi, everyone.
Wrong
Happy
way.
Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday. Wow, we are already midway through October. Time is going fast. It's getting cold here in Seattle, and you said in DC it's getting chilly as
Yeah, it's
well,
getting
right?
colder as well. Getting
Yeah,
pretty fall-like.
and so we've got some warm topics for everyone today in our 15-minute empathy power up. We've been talking about generational trauma. We've been talking about trauma last episode last week. We sort of dove deep into that and understood a little bit about where generational trauma comes from. And this is a heavy topic. This is a topic that is designed for the fall to get warmed up with a blanket and learn and listen. And I want to do that. And Amy, I'm excited to learn today. And there's a quote that you shared that I think is so powerful to help us center and sort of focus on what we're talking about today. And it's by Maya Angelou. And no man can know where he is going unless he knows exactly where he has been and exactly how he arrived at his present place. I think that's incredible. And then the second quote, another quote by Bessel van der Kolk, um, which is also, I think, resonant of what I'm hoping to learn today and what our audience is hoping to learn today is once you start approaching your body with curiosity rather than with fear, everything shifts. The body keeps the score. And both these quotes sort of reflect and resonate so strongly to me. So before I take too much more time, I'm excited to learn about our lizard brains and trauma in today's episode. So Amy,
Mm.
tell me all about our lizard brain.
You're like ready to receive. I love it. And thanks for sharing those quotes. I think that helps ground us in the conversation today. And, last week we did talk about kind of like trauma and what is trauma. And today I'm gonna talk a little bit about our lizard brains. So the first part is that trauma really happens in our body. It's this body's a protective response to an event or series of events that it perceives as dangerous. So it can manifest as fight, flight, or flee, or freeze. We talked about that last week, but there's this combination of like pain, fear, dread, anxiety, unpleasant thoughts, reactive behaviors, all these different sensations and experiences. And then that trauma gets stuck in your body and it stays there stuck until it is addressed. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is like I read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is like a seminal text when it talks about trauma in their bodies and somatic healing, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this is from Resmaa Menakem in his book, My Grandmother's Hands. And it talks about a lot of these things about trauma, racialized trauma, generational trauma. And he's a therapist and has written several books in this world. And this is just like reading this book like blew my mind. And so let's get a little further into it. Like he says that we have this trauma response that we can have this trauma response to anything we perceive as a threat, but not to our physical safety, but to what we do, say, think, care about, believe in, or yearn for. So this is the lizard brain that we're talking about, right? So our lizard brain, there's two different kinds of brain, parts of our brain. There's this, the prefrontal cortex that deals with like the reasoning and thoughts behind us, and then our motor skills are in that lizard brain that we have. So it is protective, it's protecting us, it's strong. So also Daniel Kahneman also wrote about this in his social behavioral science text, Thinking Fast and Slow. So our lizard brain is thinking really quickly. It's responding to what is happening to keep us safe, and it fears and hates whatever it is that creates harm for us. And then we have this thinking brain, right, the cortex, that we think of this as as a lot of us think of us as this tiny CEO in our head, which makes executive decisions. But this is actually a misguided metaphor, because we don't even get a chance to have the opportunity to think about something, because we're thinking with our lizard brain. So, our lizard or reptilian brain is always asks the same question: is this dangerous or safe? So, grabbing something like a hot pot or something like that, you're going to immediately like respond to it because it's dangerous. You're going to burn your hand. But then your brain later catches up on like why it actually happened. So this is the world that we live in on a daily basis, and this is our body, right? We have fear, hopes, and reactions in this space. So we also constrict and relax. So such overreactions are the body's attempt to complete a protective action that gets thwarted or overridden during a traumatic situation. So the body might want to fight or flee, but we might not be able to do so. So we might get stuck in a freeze mode. So in many cases, it develops strategies around us, around the stickiness, which is might be extreme reactions, compulsions, likes and dislikes, irrational fears, and unusual avoidance and strategies. So over time, and this is an important part, this can be embedded in the body as a standard way of surviving and protecting yourself. So if you're always being exposed to trauma, these strategies are repeated and passed on over generations. They can become the standard response in our families, in our communities, and in our culture.
Yeah, and so many good sort of insights in that, and the parts that you showed, like when we pass this on, it sort of imprints in us this response, this reaction. And so, for example, if like I imagine, and it's like when my grandfather was and my grandmother were married, for example, and my grandfather was the man in charge, and the grandmother had to do these things. It got passed on to my mother, and my mother, even though she became a lawyer, she wanted to drive, but she never did all those things because she followed, and her reaction was always, oh, I'll do the safe thing, take care of the kids, and do this. Like in a way, like I know that's not trauma, so to speak, but it is some form of this societal system where the women were oppressed. But in this case, I can see that behavior, and you don't realize even that what you're doing is harming yourself in this, or it's in some way. And I think that's an interesting insight.
Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, I think also that we have to assume that the people around us are doing the best they can with the resources that they have, right?
Yeah.
And those resources might not be so great, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they have experienced trauma, or what I'm going to tell you about in a minute. The past traumas have actually like stunted them in some way or form or fashion. And Resma brings up this concept of like trauma ghosting, he says. And this is the body's recurrent or pervasive sense that danger is just around the corner, or something terrible is going to happen at any moment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you're in an unsafe environment, if you are, whether it's at home or in the workplace or in your relationship, you're always going to be on a high alert, right?
Yeah.
That's trauma unto itself.
And I think like a strong example for this, and when you shared that, I was like, oh, I see that, because now when I go to gay bars or I go to a gay club, since Pulse happened, because Pulse was such a big part of my life. My best friend was there the night of the shooting.
Wow.
And that is the first place. That's the place I had my first kiss with my husband, and that's where I spent my years in US. And now when I go to a bar, I'm always like on high alert, like, oh, and it's just natural, instinctual, even though I wasn't there in that incident. So yeah. Oh wow. Yeah, please keep going.
Yeah. So what Resma talks about is that this attempting to reenact this event often simply repeats, reinflicts, and deepens the traumas that you may have experienced, right? It may experience or even haven't experienced, but it just becomes deeper trauma. So when this happens repeatedly over time, the trauma response can look like part of the person's personality. right?
Mm.
So anxiety, depression,
Ah, yeah.
these kinds of things. As years and decades pass, reflexive traumatic experiences can lose context. So what traumatized you before might not have context today. And a person may forget that something happened to him or her and then internalize those trauma responses, right? So it's just this is the insidiousness of this trauma response. So these responses are typically viewed by others and often by the person as a personality defect.
Mm.
And then
Mm.
this is my one of, I think, my favorite parts about the whole book. He says, when the same strategy gets internalized and passed down over generations within a particular group, it can start to look like culture.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a strong sentence. And I just wanted to make
Yeah, I want
one
to read it.
correction with love for the audience. When we say him or her, we need to make sure it's them. We want to be more inclusive, and we got
Ah,
to unlearn those things. But yeah, so coming back to this incredible thing that it looks like culture. And I think that is such a fundamentally important insight here, is that when trauma just passed on and on and on, it becomes culture. Like the culture where my mom would say, yeah, we were beat as kids and that's what's going to happen to you, right? Like that is culture. Like that's how
mhm.
parenting works. And like that's those are various examples. Oh my gosh, such a powerful insight.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I want to read that again so that we can soak it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
When this same strategy gets internalized and passed down over generations within a particular group, it can start to look like culture.
Yeah. Wow.
So, but therapists actually call this traumatic retention.
Uh-huh.
And so this brings me to like this concept of like generational trauma that we kind of kicked the time off. And this is where some more science, I'm going to throw some more science at you. So we have evidence that memories are connected to painful events also gets passed down from parent to child and to
Mm.
that child's child, right? What's more, these experiences appear to be held, passed on, and inherited in the body, not just in the thinking brain. So often people think of this as a persistent sense of an imminent doom, the trauma ghosting that we were just talking,
Mm.
right? And we're only beginning to understand how these processes work in our brain because the brain is super complex and there are a lot of details we don't know. So we're still discovering these things. So here's the things we do know. Number one, a fetus growing inside the womb of a traumatized mother may inherit some of that trauma in its DNA.
Oh wow.
The results in the repeated release of stress hormones, which may affect the nervous system of the developing fetus. So, like going back to the story I shared last week, with my grandmother was in two concentration camps. My mother was in her womb, even as an egg, right, and as a fetus, and then it passed on to me as being in that egg and that feet, being the
Mhm. And the
egg
DNA
of
passed
my
on.
mother
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
fetus.
Yeah.
And then a man with unhealed trauma in his body may produce sperm with altered DNA. These in turn may inhibit the healthy functioning of cells in his children. Trauma can alter the DNA expression of a child or grandchild's brain, causing a wide range of health and mental health issues, including memory loss, chronic anxiety, muscle weakness, and depression. And some of these effects seem particularly prevalent among African Americans, Jews, the American Indians. These three groups specifically, and this is what Resmo was talking about, have experienced an enormous amount of historical trauma. Of
Mhm.
course, that's historically, but there's what he also says is that this kind of trauma has been happening for millennia, right?
Millennium from
Since
in many civilizations all over the world. Yeah.
exactly. And some scientists theorize that this genetic alteration may be a way to protect their generations after it. So, pretty much, our descendants' bodies are, changed through heredity, um,
Hmm.
and rather than the behavior that's around them. So, that we might have genetic defects, right? That might increase our odds of survival,
Hmm.
or on the other side of the spectrum, like it might decrease our sense of survival. Um, so what
Yeah.
we talk about is, one thing I'll say here is, Resma deeply talks about this idea of racialized trauma. And here's a quote that I think is really important. He talks about like three different groups of people. They talk about, and he's specifically talking about the US, but it could
Mhm.
be in
Yeah.
different groups of people. It's like one group is like white Anglo-Saxon people from Europe who immigrate from Europe, African Americans, and then the police, right?
Mm.
Policing. So he looks at the different ways of trauma shows up in that. And what I found was really interesting is that a lot of people might talk about like, oh, as a white person, I do not have trauma, right? Like, and so it's so focused on being like, oppressed groups have trauma, but we all have trauma. And if you're a white American, your body has probably inherited a different legacy of trauma that affects white bodies. So at times we may rekindle old fight, flight, or freeze responses. And this trauma goes back centuries, right? We talked about millennia, or at least as far back as the Middle Ages. When there were serfdoms, there was a hierarchy
Mm.
that happened. There were like poor white people and then there was rich white people. But it's been passed down from one white body to another and for dozens of generations. And so there's a whole chapter on this. I geeked out 100% on
Oh,
this,
goodness.
and it's incredible. But I see we're at like overtime. We always
Yeah.
to get overtime. So I think what I'd love to just talk about, like maybe we can pick this back up tomorrow next week, where we talk about the idea of like the three different groups: white body supremacy,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. I think
work.
that I was gonna say this is where I want to dive in and get into that. I think it's really a lot of great insight, and I think we could even connect it to examples of people not wanting to wear a mask or not getting vaccines, and some of those things can bring into this is what is that? Why is that coming through? It's not that these are bad people or they hate other people. It's just that we want to understand these folks, and this is another dimension we can bring in.
Yeah.
Wow, what a great! I am just loving the opportunity to learn today, and I learned so much. Thank you, Amy, for sharing those and doing the research and bringing this informed scientific approach to our conversation. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Um, and for everyone, I hope you'll continue this journey as we give you that weekly power boost with the Empathy Power Up. See you next week. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here with us. Take care. Bye.